I love to talk about underrated players, but truly I don't think anyone fits the mold of underrated more than Brandin Cooks, a star who's not getting the credit that I think he deserves. So without any further ado, let's get into this.
Quick pass, it's Cooks, blockers ahead, Cooks turns on the Jets, Cooks, see you later!
Brandin Twan Cooks was born in Stockton, California to Andrea and Worth Cooks Sr. on September 25, 1993. Early on, life changed for Brandin after his father, Worth Sr., passed away when he was only a child, and from then on, he and his 3 older brothers were raised by a single mother. Nonetheless, as only a 9-year-old, Brandin was so fast that he not only advanced to the regional track and field finals in San Jose, but somehow won the whole thing, which is just a testament to the fact that growing up, Brandin was simply a stud at whatever he did. But although he ran track and did his thing on the basketball court, it was on the football field that he really shined at Lincoln High. As only a sophomore with the Trojans, Brandin somehow put up 600 yards and 7 touchdowns on only 29 catches, and upon that was able to carry that level of play into his junior year, where he took it up a notch with this time nearly 800 yards and 10 touchdowns. After what was already a solid career, you would think that the back-to-back impressive performances would make it difficult for Brandin to best himself as a senior, but actually it was quite the opposite, as he put up over 1,100 yards and 11 touchdowns. Considering how well Brandin played in his time at Lincoln, it made sense that he was a 3-star recruit, since he was in a state loaded with talent like Cali. So with that in mind, as you could guess, Brandin didn't have the biggest West Coast programs like USC or Oregon after him, but I would say that UCLA, Utah, and Washington were not too bad a group of choices. Initially, Brandin committed to the Bruins out there at UCLA, but eventually decided to flip it to Oregon State because he wasn't the biggest fan of the UCLA pistol offense, and upon that, the fact that they were considering moving him to defense. So even though Oregon State wasn't a powerhouse, or even on a similar level to the Bruins, in his own words, Brandin had to follow his heart and just knew where he wanted to go. Even though the Beavers weren't exactly one of the most stacked teams in college football when Brandin was a freshman, expectations still weren't anything but the bottom of the barrel for his first year, and yet, just like at Lincoln, he did pretty well. Although he was on a very underwhelming 3-9 Beavers team, Brandin was still able to put up nearly 400 yards and 3 touchdowns, and upon that was able to make an appearance in all 12 games, which is very unique for only a first-year player. But nonetheless, Brandin made a great first impression with the Beavers, so going into his sophomore season, many were curious about whether or not he would take a step backward or forward. But let's just say that he didn't leave much up for question.
Sean looks in the end zone, Cooks open, caught, touchdown Beavers, and the Beavers have won it.
From beginning to end, Brandin put together one of the best performances of any wideout in college football that year, as his over 1,100 yards and 5 touchdowns, along with impressive play by senior wideout Marcus Whedon, made for one of the most dominant air attacks in the Pac-12. Not only did the receiving core just improve, but so did the Beavers as a whole, as they went from 3-9 to 9-4 in only one season, which in large part is due to the amount of talent on the offensive side. But nonetheless, after what was a massive all-around improvement by the studs in Corvallis, it seemed like a tall task to take it up a notch the following year, but at the very least, Brandin did. If you thought his 1,100 yards and 5 touchdowns were good, well, try over 1,700 yards and 16 touchdowns on for size. Because all across the board, Brandin was the man in Oregon State now that his former bud and Marcus had left for the NFL. And crazy enough, that year, Cook's receptions and receiving yards were both Pac-12 records. So it wasn't all that much of a shock that he was not just a consensus All-American, but a Biletnikoff Award winner as seemingly the best wideout in all college football. Needless to say, it was not too shabby a season for Brandin, and so it wasn't much of a surprise that he declared for the NFL draft after what was by far and away one of the most impressive performances in Oregon State history. Interestingly enough, Brandin also ran track with the Beavers, and the experience out there helped him in more ways than one, as his 4.33 40-yard dash helped him jump many draft boards, as he quickly became seen as a first-round talent.
The New Orleans Saints select Brandin Cooks, wide receiver, Oregon State.
Sorry to stop the video, but since you're here, it'd be awesome if you could subscribe, like, turn on post notifications, and comment down below if you think that Brandin Cooks is underrated. But anyways, back to the video. Brandin was selected 20th off the board by the New Orleans Saints, who had traded up a few picks to Arizona in order to move up from their spot at the 27th, and surprisingly enough made Brandin the highest drafted player out of Oregon State since Ken Carpenter back in 1950, and upon that the highest drafted wide receiver in school history. So with all that in mind, you would think that there would be a lot of hype around Brandin's rookie season, but considering that the Saints had a loaded offense with guys like Drew Brees, Mark Ingram, Jimmy Graham, and the uber underrated Marquise Colston, not much was expected out of his first year, and yet he did pretty dang well.
Means to be patient. And we are whenever we say his name. What a catch! Brandin Cooks!
Unlike his freshman season at Oregon State, Brandin was only able to play in 10 games as a rookie, and yet was still able to put up over 500 yards and 3 touchdowns, which is all the more impressive when you realize that his year was pretty much cut in half because of a thumb injury. But no matter the case, the performance was good enough to solidify Brandin as a stud, although he got lost in the mix with guys like Mike Evans, Jarvis Landry, and this dude.
This is sick. Put this to music. I don't think he stepped out either. That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen.
All this in mind, going into 2015, there was next to no expectations on what Brandin would do in his sophomore season, even after he was able to earn the #1 spot in the receiver room over a stud in Marquise Colson. But nonetheless, just like his time with the Beavers, the whole underrated thing didn't change the fact that Brandin is a stud, and let's just say that he proved it that season. Now that he was able to play the entire year, Brandin put up over 1,100 yards and 9 touchdowns, as he once again proved that when he had the opportunity, my man shows up, and shows up big time. So after what was a very impressive performance, going into the following season, it wasn't much of a surprise that Brandin was seen as a potential breakout candidate by ESPN. Pressure is nothing new for a stud like Brandin, so even though he didn't go crazy with 1,700 yards like his time at Oregon State, his nearly 1,200 and 8 touchdowns were still solid, although not exactly breakout numbers, mainly because a rookie superstar and Michael Thomas took up quite a bit of the limelight.
Breeze hesitates for Michael Thomas, and it's juggled. He caught it, and he fell in the end zone for a touchdown.
The fact that Mr. Thomas played so well as only a rookie changed the entire atmosphere in New Orleans, as Brandin went from the #1 to playing second fiddle to the Ohio State superstar, which likely was a big part in what happened next. On March 10, 2017, the Patriots traded their 2017 first and third round picks to New Orleans in exchange for Brandin and a 4th rounder, as Mr. Cooks packed his bags and took a trip to good old Foxborough after 3 years in the Big Easy. Going into his first season with the Pats, Brandin was going into a receiver room with the superstar in Gronk and good old Chris Hogan, so needless to say, there was quite a bit of opportunity for him to do his thing, and just like always, he did.
And here they're going to go long again. Open is Cooks! Cooks! No one near him!
Although he was halfway across the country, Mr. Cooks didn't miss a beat, as he was able to put up nearly 1,100 yards and 7 touchdowns on what was a dominant Super Bowl New England team. But let's just say that Brandin wasn't able to make it all the way.
And then Cooks! He is down.
Maybe the Patriots could have won if Brandin played the entire game, but it didn't matter, because in the end they lost. And although the Cookie Monster was dominant once again, it didn't change the fact that he wasn't staying in New England all that long.
Brandin Cooks from the Patriots, Mike, to the Rams.
On April 3rd, 2018, less than 2 months after getting absolutely clobbered by Philly, Brandin was traded along with a 4th round pick to Los Angeles for a 1st and 6th rounder, as he signed a 5-year deal to join what was a very up-and-coming Rams team. Unlike at New England, Brandin was joining a pretty loaded receiver room, with young studs like Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp quickly finding their own with good old Jared Goff tossing the rock. So with all that in mind, there wasn't nearly as much riding on Brandin's play as there was back in New England and Orleans. And yet, as you guessed it, he did his thing.
Down LA, going for the whole thing. Cooks. Touchdown!
For the 4th straight year in a row, Brandin had over 1,000 yards receiving, with this time just over 1,200 and 5 touchdowns on what was once again another Super Bowl team. Funny enough, Brandin matched up against his former squad in New England, but even though the Rams were firing on all cylinders going into the big game, let's just say that Brandin and the rest of LA left a lot to be desired.
Gilmore grabs his arm just a little bit. Harmon comes over. Got to make that catch.
Although he lost back-to-back Super Bowls, at least this time he was able to stay on the team for longer than 1 season, as he went into the offseason looking to do his thing in good old LA. And just like every other year, he started off strong, but concussions and overall just underwhelming play kept him from putting up anything better than 580 and 2 touchdowns. Following 4 years of super solid play, a slump was inevitable, but it seems like LA wasn't all that big a fan, as the down year put Brandin on the chopping block once again.
On Thursday, Houston acquires Brandin Cooks from the Rams.
On April 10th, 2020, Cooks and a 4th round pick were traded to Houston in exchange for a 2nd rounder, as Brandin once again had to pack his bags and travel halfway across the country. If you think about it, Brandin did a complete loop of the United States from New Orleans to New England, then LA, and eventually Houston. And yet, somehow he was still able to put up solid numbers all but 1 year. But nonetheless, coming off his worst year to date, I'm sure Brandin was looking to get back to business on what was a very interesting Texans team with Deshaun Watson and Will Fuller. And although it seemed like a tall task, just like always, he did it.
Moves out, going for it all downfield. It is
Brandin put up 1,150 yards and 6 touchdowns in this time 15 games, as he was once again the number 1 in this time Houston. So even though the Texans went 4-12, at the very least Mr. Cooks proved that he was still a stud. Going into 2021, Brandin was the starting wide receiver in Houston, and this time put up over 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns on a pretty underwhelming Texans team that seemed to be destined for rough waters after missing a certain superstar quarterback. But no matter the case, Brandin was playing well, and so even though there were trade rumors going into the following offseason, Mr. Cook signed a 2-year deal to stay in Houston. But although he was able to play in 13 games that season, let's just say that he had a bit of a slump once again. A combination of injuries, quarterback problems, and general struggles kept Brandin from doing his thing once again, although he was still able to lead the team with just under 700 yards and 3 touchdowns. But no matter the case, the writing was on the wall for Brandin and the Texans, as they were looking to rebuild and he was looking to find a new spot elsewhere. So what happened next wasn't all that big a surprise.
Dallas figured once they got into March, like, hey, we don't love the free agency class necessarily, so now they got Cooks.
A few days from me writing this, on March 19th, 2023, Brandin was traded to the Dallas Cowboys in exchange for a 5th and 6th round pick, as Mr. Cooks tied the NFL all-time record for being the most traded player with the former superstar and Eric Dickerson. Thankfully for Brandin, he didn't have to move all that far this time, as he only had to travel up the state to join his 5th team in 7 years, which usually only happens with underwhelming players. So it's pretty wild that Brandin has played well through it all, and I would say that it makes his future in Dallas pretty dang interesting.
Especially O.J. Howard. The throw to the end zone. Brandin Cooks.
This time around, Brandin is the number 2 behind a phenom in CeeDee Lamb and just above a stud in Michael Gallup, in what I think is a very similar situation to the one he had in LA, although a few years down the road. Nonetheless, since Brandin is nearly 30 years old, let's just say the clock is ticking, and even though he's already had a solid career, I'm sure he would love a Super Bowl or Pro Bowl nod before he hangs it up. And honestly, I find it wild how he's not gotten either, considering everything that's happened up until this point. We'll see what Brandin does next in Dallas, but needless to say, he has put together quite a unique career in the league, and so considering his journey to the place where he is today, I would say he's one of the most impressive players in the league. But anyways, what do you guys think? Is Brandin Cooks one of the most underrated players in football, or is that right where he should be? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Brandin Cooks is a one-of-a-kind person, player, and talent, so it'll be super exciting to see what he does next. And let's just say that I have a feeling that it will be pretty dang awesome.
Goff, deep, touchdown, Cooks!
Thanks for watching the video. If you guys enjoyed, make sure to subscribe, like, turn on post notifications, and comment down below stuff you want next. But anyways, see you all soon, and God bless.